Where is he? I can't see him. Look in the water. He's under there, bows not letting go. Somebody call for help. Get the rescue team down here now. This wasn't just a fishing trip gone wrong. It was a warning ignored for decades. If this story disturbs you, it should, because it's not the first time. And if nothing changes, it won't be the last. Wait, let's go back to the beginning. It was supposed to be just another peaceful morning on the Zambezi River. A quiet fishing expedition in waters Norman Lee had navigated for over 15 years. A routine trip that had become second nature through years of experience, caution, and respect for the river. But what happened next would leave his fishing companions frozen in terror and would mark the last day of Norman Lee's life. In broad daylight, on calm waters, something snapped. This isn't just a tragic story, it's a wake-up call. You're watching a story they don't want you to hear. If you believe the truth deserves a voice, stay with us until the end and share this to keep the conversation going. Chapter 1. The Fisherman's Passion. Norman Lee was just 35 years old, experienced, careful, and deeply passionate about his craft. When he first started fishing the Zambezi River back in 2008, he wasn't just another weekend angler. He was the kind of person who studied the water with scientific precision. He respected the wildlife with genuine reverence, and he understood the delicate balance between man and nature better than most. To his fellow anglers, Norman was more than just a fishing partner. He was a mentor, a guide, and a friend. The guy who shared his best spots without hesitation. The one who always carried extra gear for newcomers. The one who knew every bend in the river, every seasonal pattern, every safe harbor. His reputation extended far beyond his local fishing community. Norman's father, Thomas Lee, a retired river guide himself, remembered how his son had fallen in love with the Zambezi as a teenager. From the first time I took him out there, I knew he belonged on that river, Thomas recalled. He had this natural instinct, this ability to read the water like it was speaking to him. But more than that, he respected it. He never took it for granted. Margaret, Norman's wife of 12 years, often said he lived for those dawn departures, those magical moments when the mist hung low over the water and the world was still quiet. Norman would spend hours the night before preparing his equipment. He checked weather patterns obsessively. He planned routes that would keep his group safe while maximizing their chances of success. Every detail mattered to him. His tackle box was a work of art, organized with military precision. Each lure had its place. Each weight was calculated for specific conditions. Norman had notebooks filled with detailed observations about water temperature, fish behavior, and seasonal migrations. He approached fishing like a scientist, but with the heart of a poet. Margaret remembered how Norman would wake up at 4 in the morning, moving quietly through the house so as not to disturb her. He would make his coffee, check the weather one more time, and load his truck with the reverence of someone performing a sacred ritual. Fishing wasn't just what Norman did, she said. It was who he was. But there was one stretch of river that meant more to Norman than any other. A secluded bend about 12 miles upstream from the main lodge. A place where the water ran deep and clear, where the fishing was extraordinary. Local guides called it the Honey Hole, but Norman had his own name for it. He called it Paradise Point. The spot held special significance for Norman. It was where he had caught his first tigerfish as a teenager, where he had proposed to Margaret on a sunset cruise, where he had scattered his father's ashes just 2 years earlier. Paradise Point wasn't just a fishing destination, it was a sanctuary, a place where Norman felt most connected to the river he loved so much. He had been fishing there for over a decade, always with the same careful approach. Anchor well away from the shore, keep voices low, respect the hippo's territory. Norman understood something that many tourists and casual anglers didn't. Humans were visitors in this ancient ecosystem. Temporary guests in a world that had existed long before them and would continue long after they were gone. Norman's approach to Paradise Point was almost ceremonial. He would arrive just before dawn, when the hippos were usually resting on the banks. He would circle the area slowly, checking for signs of wildlife activity. Only when he was certain it was safe would he drop anchor in his carefully chosen spot. 50 yards from shore, positioned to take advantage of the current, but far enough away to avoid territorial conflicts. Over the years, Norman had developed an almost supernatural ability to read the river. He could spot a hippo pod from hundreds of yards away. He knew when to retreat and when it was safe to stay. He always maintained safe distances, respected wildlife corridors, and never pushed his luck. His fishing journals, later found by investigators, detailed meticulous observations about wildlife behavior, water levels, and seasonal changes. The journals revealed a man who was deeply in tune with his environment. Norman tracked hippo movement patterns, noting which areas they frequented during different seasons. He recorded water temperatures, current speeds, and weather patterns. He documented fish behavior, feeding times, and migration routes. His observations were so detailed that wildlife researchers later used them to better understand the river's ecosystem. But perhaps most telling were Norman's personal reflections, scattered throughout the technical observations. "The river teaches you patience," he wrote in one entry. "It teaches you humility. It reminds you that you're part of something bigger than yourself. Every time I'm out there, I'm reminded of how small we really are." Norman's friends and family often spoke about his deep respect for the wildlife that shared his beloved river. He never littered, never disturbed nesting areas, and always followed catch and release practices for endangered species. He'd even helped organize river cleanup efforts and wildlife conservation fundraisers. To Norman, being a fisherman meant being a steward of the environment. But on August 14th, 2023, all of that experience would fail him. All of that caution would prove insufficient. All of that respect for nature wouldn't be enough to save his life. Because sometimes the river has its own plans, and sometimes even the most careful preparation can't protect you from a predator that has already decided you're an intruder. Chapter 2. The Territorial Giant. Bao was not just any hippo. At over 4 tons and nearly 14 feet long, he was the undisputed ruler of his stretch of the Zambezi River. His massive frame could move through water with surprising grace, but his temperament was anything but gentle. His very presence commanded respect and fear from every creature that shared his domain. Local wildlife officials had been tracking Bao for over 8 years. Born in the wild around 2010, he had established his territory along the very stretch of river where Norman loved to fish. Unlike younger hippos who might share space or retreat when confronted, Bao had earned his dominance through years of fierce territorial battles. Each scar on his hide told a story of violence and victory. His hide bore the deep marks of countless conflicts, jagged gashes from rival males who had challenged his authority, old wounds from crocodile encounters where both predators had tested each other's limits. The weathered scars of a hippo who had never backed down from a fight, who had never shown weakness in the face of opposition. Bao was a living testament to the brutal reality of river hierarchy. Wildlife photographer James Mitchell, who had been documenting the river's ecosystem for National Geographic, described Bao as the most formidable hippo I've ever encountered in 20 years of African wildlife photography. Mitchell had spent weeks observing the massive bull, documenting his behavior patterns and territorial displays. "He's not just territorial," Mitchell explained in a detailed interview with investigators. "He's actively aggressive in ways I've never seen before. Most hippos will give you warning signs when you encroach on their space. They'll grunt loudly, they'll show their massive teeth, they'll charge partway towards you and then retreat. It's a bluff designed to scare you away without actual violence. Bao doesn't bluff. When he moves toward you, he means business. There's an intelligence in his eyes that's genuinely frightening." Mitchell's photographs of Bao revealed the true scale of this aquatic giant. Images showing the hippo's massive head breaking the surface, jaws agape, displaying teeth the size of railroad spikes. Pictures capturing the raw power in his movements, the way water exploded around him when he charged. The photographer's work provided crucial evidence of Bao's aggressive nature, evidence that would later be ignored by tourism officials. Hippos are already among Africa's most dangerous animals. They kill more people on the continent than any other large animal except mosquitoes. Their massive jaws can snap a canoe in half with ease. Their territorial instincts are among the strongest in the animal kingdom. An adult male like Bao can hold his breath for up to 5 minutes, allowing for surprise attacks from below. They can swim faster than most boats when motivated. And they can bite with a force of over 1/800 pounds per square inch, enough to crush bone like paper. But Bao was different even among his own kind. Park rangers had noted his unusual behavior patterns in reports that dated back years. Where most hippos were content to establish territories of a few hundred yards along the riverbank, Bao patrolled nearly 2 miles of water. His territory was vast by hippo standards, and he defended every inch of it with lethal determination. He was known to track boats that entered his domain, following them silently underwater for significant distances. Unlike other hippos who might surface to warn intruders away, Bao would remain submerged, stalking his targets like a submarine predator. Rangers reported finding boat debris scattered across his territory, aluminum hulls torn apart by massive teeth, oars snapped in half, engines damaged by powerful jaws. Dr. Patricia Williams, a zoologist who had studied the Zambezi hippo population for over 20 years, later testified in court proceedings that Bao exhibited atypical aggression patterns that made him particularly dangerous to humans. In 30 years of fieldwork across 6 African countries, I've never documented a hippo with such an extended territorial range combined with such persistent stalking behavior, she stated under oath. Dr. Williams' research revealed disturbing details about Bao's hunting patterns. Unlike typical hippos who were primarily defensive in their aggression, Bao appeared to actively seek out confrontations. He would position himself near popular fishing spots, waiting for boats to approach. Camera traps set up by researchers captured footage of the massive bull patrolling his territory at all hours, day and night, seemingly searching for intruders. The locals knew about Bao intimately. They had been living with his presence for years. Fishermen from nearby villages called him Mvu Wakali, which roughly translates to the angry river horse, or the hippo of wrath. Traditional fishermen gave his territory a wide berth, especially during breeding season when his aggression peaked to dangerous levels. Village elder Marcus Tembo, whose family had fished the Zambezi for generations, spoke about Bao with a mixture of respect and fear. That Hippo is different from the others, Tembo explained through an interpreter. He doesn't just defend his home, he hunts for trouble. We tell our people to stay away from the Big Bend, especially when the sun is high and he's most active. Our grandfathers taught us to read the signs, to know when the river is safe and when it's angry. Bao makes the river angry all the time. Local fishing protocols had evolved around Bao's presence. Traditional fishermen used specific routes that avoided his territory entirely. They fished in groups, with designated watchers whose only job was to scan for signs of the massive hippo. They carried noisemakers, drums, and bells that could alert others to danger. Most importantly, they shared information, passing warnings from village to village about Bao's movements and moods. But somehow, this indigenous knowledge never made it to the tourist fishing guides. The cultural gap between traditional fishermen and commercial tourism operators meant that crucial safety information was never shared. The tour companies, focused on providing clients with pristine fishing experiences in unspoiled locations, either didn't know about the local warnings or chose to ignore them. The tour operators marketed Paradise Point as a premier fishing destination, emphasizing its pristine beauty and excellent fishing opportunities. Their brochures featured photographs of smiling anglers holding impressive catches, with no mention of the territorial predator that ruled those waters. Safety briefings mentioned general wildlife precautions, but never specifically warned about Bao or his documented history of aggression. This knowledge gap would prove fatal. While traditional fishermen avoided Bao's territory based on generations of accumulated wisdom, recreational anglers like Norman continued to fish in waters that locals knew were deadly. The tourism industry's focus on profit over safety created a perfect storm for tragedy. Chapter 3. The Warning Signs. It wasn't just one incident. It was a pattern, subtle at first, but growing more ominous with each passing month. The signs were there for anyone willing to look, but in the tourism industry, looking too closely at danger can be bad for business. In March 2023, just 5 months before the tragedy, a fishing guide named Robert Thompson reported an unusual encounter with a large male hippo. According to his incident report, filed with the local tourism board, the hippo had approached his boat aggressively, circling it for nearly 20 minutes before finally withdrawing. This was not normal behavior, Thompson wrote. The animal seemed to be studying us, learning our patterns. I've guided these waters for 12 years, and I've never seen anything like it." The report was filed, acknowledged, and forgotten. 2 months later, in May, another guide reported finding the remains of a small fishing boat about a mile downstream from Paradise Point. The aluminum hull was cracked and twisted, with puncture marks that wildlife experts later confirmed were consistent with hippo teeth. No bodies were found, but personal effects suggested the boat had been occupied when it was destroyed. The incident was attributed to equipment failure in the official report. No investigation was launched, no safety warnings were issued, and no restrictions were placed on fishing in the area. Then came the near miss in July. A honeymooning couple from Germany, Hans and Greta Mueller, were fishing with guide David Price when their boat was suddenly rammed from below. The impact threw Greta into the water, where she found herself face to face with a massive hippo. "I could see his eyes," she later told investigators. "They were intelligent, calculating. He wasn't just angry, he was hunting." David Price managed to pull her back into the boat seconds before the hippo's jaws snapped shut where she had been floating. Price filed an emergency report with the local authorities, demanding immediate action. He provided GPS coordinates, photographs of the damage to his boat, and a detailed account of the encounter. He specifically identified the hippo as an unusually large male with distinctive scarring on his left flank. The response was a form letter thanking him for his wildlife observation report and assuring him that appropriate personnel would monitor the situation. No restrictions were implemented, no warnings were issued, and no additional safety measures were put in place. Word began to spread among the local guides. Hushed conversations in the lodge bars, careful warnings shared between colleagues, whispered discussions about the big male who was becoming increasingly aggressive. Some guides began avoiding the area entirely, but others, driven by the promise of excellent fishing and generous tips, continued to take clients to Paradise Point. Norman Lee, as an independent angler who often fished alone or with friends rather than hiring guides, never received these warnings. He continued his regular trips to his favorite spot, unaware that each visit was being watched by 4 tons of territorial fury. The tourism board, for its part, maintained its silence. No public warnings were issued, no safety advisories were posted, and no changes were made to fishing regulations. The potential impact on the local economy, they reasoned, outweighed the relatively small risk of an actual attack. But by August, the risk was no longer small. It was imminent, and it was about to claim a life. Chapter 4. The Fatal Encounter. August 14th, 2023. It was a perfect morning for fishing on the Zambezi River. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of river vegetation and morning dew. The water was calm, reflecting the early morning sky like polished glass. And Norman Lee was in his element, preparing for what he believed would be another memorable day on his beloved river. Norman had launched his boat before dawn, accompanied by his longtime fishing partner Marcus Webb and Marcus's brother-in-law Tony Phillips. The 3 men had been planning this trip for weeks, coordinating schedules and sharing excitement about the prospects ahead. Marcus was celebrating his retirement after 30 years as a mechanical engineer. Tony was visiting from England for the first time, eager to experience African fishing. Norman was excited to share his favorite spot with them, confident that Paradise Point would provide the kind of fishing experience they would remember for a lifetime. The boat ride to Paradise Point took them through some of the most beautiful scenery on the river. Early morning mist clung to the banks, wildlife moved through the vegetation, and the water sparkled in the rising sun. Norman pointed out landmarks along the way, sharing stories about previous fishing trips and explaining the river's seasonal patterns. His enthusiasm was infectious, and both Marcus and Tony found themselves caught up in the magic of the African river. They reached the familiar bend in the river just as the sun was breaking over the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold. Norman anchored his boat in the same spot he had used dozens of times before, about 50 yards from the shore in what he considered the perfect position for catching tigerfish. The location offered access to deep water where the big fish lurked, while maintaining what Norman believed was a safe distance from the shore and any territorial hippos. The morning started perfectly. Norman's years of experience paid off as he guided his companions to the best fishing spots. He showed them how to read the water, where to cast for maximum effect, and how to handle the powerful tigerfish that made the Zambezi famous among anglers. His expertise was evident in every aspect of the trip, from his tackle selection to his understanding of fish behavior. For the first hour, everything was perfect. The fish were biting with encouraging regularity. The conversation was flowing naturally, and the beauty of the African river was on full display. Marcus landed a beautiful specimen, a tigerfish that would have been impressive anywhere in the world. Tony was amazed by the wildlife, constantly pointing out birds and other animals along the riverbank. Norman was in his element, sharing his passion with friends and watching them experience the magic that had captivated him for so many years. The three men fell into an easy rhythm. Norman provided expert guidance, while Marcus and Tony absorbed every detail of the experience. They discussed fishing techniques, shared stories about their lives, and marveled at the pristine beauty surrounding them. The boat was filled with laughter, friendly competition, and the kind of camaraderie that makes fishing trips memorable. But beneath the surface, they were being watched. Bao had detected their presence the moment they entered his territory. The massive hippo had been tracking their boat from the depths, following their movements with the patience of an apex predator. His territorial instincts were fully activated, and he was evaluating these intruders with the calculating intelligence that made him so dangerous. At approximately 8:30 a.m., Tony noticed something unusual breaking the calm surface of the water. "There's something moving in the water over there," he said, pointing toward the shore, with genuine curiosity rather than alarm. "Is that a log floating downstream?" Norman looked where Tony was pointing and immediately recognized the telltale signs of a hippo. Two small humps breaking the surface, barely visible except to an experienced eye like his. The positioning and movement patterns were unmistakable to someone who had spent years studying river wildlife. "That's a hippo," he said calmly, his voice carrying the confidence of experience. "Nothing to worry about. They usually keep to themselves if we don't get too close." But this hippo wasn't keeping to himself. Over the next 10 minutes, the animal moved steadily closer to their boat, displaying behavior that Norman had never witnessed in all his years on the river. The approach was deliberate, methodical, and deeply unsettling to anyone who understood hippo behavior patterns. Norman began to feel uneasy, something he had never experienced in all his years on the Zambezi. His instincts, honed by decades of river experience, were telling him that something was wrong. The hippo's approach was too direct, too purposeful, too aggressive for a normal territorial display. This wasn't a warning, it was preparation for attack. "Maybe we should move," Marcus suggested, noticing the tension in his friend's voice and the change in Norman's normally confident demeanor. The experienced angler's unease was beginning to affect his companions, who trusted his judgment completely. "Yeah," Norman agreed quickly, already starting to pull in his fishing line with movements that spoke of urgency rather than his usual methodical approach. "Let's give him some space. Something doesn't feel right about this one." But as Norman reached for the anchor rope, preparing to move his boat to a safer location, the water beneath them suddenly exploded in a fury of violence that none of them could have imagined. The calm surface, that had seemed so peaceful moments before, became a maelstrom of spray, foam, and terror. Bao emerged from the depths like a nightmare made real, a creature of pure aggression and territorial fury. 4 tons of muscle and bone launched upward from the river bottom, jaws gaping wide enough to swallow a man whole, eyes fixed on Norman with unmistakable intent. The boat lurched violently as the hippo's massive head struck the aluminum hull with devastating force. Tony screamed in terror, a sound that echoed across the water and sent birds fleeing from nearby trees. Marcus grabbed for the emergency radio with desperate urgency, his hands shaking as he tried to call for help. Norman fought to maintain his balance as the boat rocked wildly from side to side, water sloshing over the gunnels with each violent movement. "Get the engine started!" Norman shouted above the chaos, but before Marcus could reach the controls, Bao struck again with even greater violence. This time, his massive jaws clamped down on the side of the boat, puncturing the aluminum hull like paper. The sound of tearing metal mixed with the hippo's aggressive grunting created a symphony of terror. Water began pouring in through the jagged holes as the boat listed dangerously to one side. Norman grabbed for the life preservers, but the hippo's next attack sent him tumbling toward the water. The boat's stability was completely compromised. and the three men found themselves fighting for their lives in a vessel that was rapidly becoming uninhabitable. "Norman!" Marcus screamed, lunging forward to grab his friend's arm in a desperate attempt to keep him in the boat. But he was too late, and the physics of the situation were working against them. Norman hit the water just as Bao's jaws closed around his torso with the sound of crushing bone. The hippo's teeth, designed by evolution to crush bone and sinew, penetrated deep into Norman's body with devastating effect. Blood clouded the water immediately as the massive animal dragged him beneath the surface, disappearing into the murky depths with his victim clamped firmly in his jaws. Marcus and Tony watched in horror as their friend disappeared into the dark water, pulled down by 4 tons of aquatic predator. The water thrashed violently for several seconds that seemed like hours, then suddenly went still with an ominous finality. Bao surfaced once, Norman's lifeless body still clamped in his massive jaws, then disappeared again into the depths like a submarine returning to the darkness. The attack lasted less than 2 minutes, but it felt like an eternity to the 2 survivors. When the water finally calmed, Norman Lee was gone, and 2 traumatized witnesses were left floating in a damaged boat, trying to comprehend what they had just witnessed. The river had claimed another victim, and Bao had sent his message loud and clear. This was his territory, and intruders were not welcome. Chapter 5. The Cover-Up Begins. The hours after Norman Lee's death were a masterclass in damage control and institutional denial. Within minutes of Marcus Webb's frantic radio call for help, the machinery of cover-up was already in motion. The tourism industry's response was swift, coordinated, and designed to minimize liability rather than address the underlying safety issues that had led to the tragedy. The first response came from the local tourism board, not the rescue services. Their representative, a smooth-talking official named Peter Hartley, arrived at the scene before the police, before the medical examiner, and certainly before any wildlife experts who might have asked uncomfortable questions. Hartley's priorities were immediately clear to everyone present. "This is a tragic accident," Hartley announced to the small crowd of officials and media that had gathered at the boat launch. His voice carried the practiced authority of someone accustomed to managing crisis situations. An unfortunate encounter with wildlife that could not have been predicted or prevented. These are the inherent risks of river recreation that all visitors must accept. But Marcus Webb and Tony Phillips knew better. They had witnessed something far more sinister than a random wildlife encounter. They had seen the calculated way Bao had stalked their boat, moving with purpose and intelligence. They had observed the deliberate nature of his attack, the unmistakable signs of territorial aggression that went far beyond normal hippo behavior. This wasn't a chance encounter with a startled animal. It was a targeted assault by a predator that had been displaying dangerous behavior for months. "We tried to tell them about what we saw," Marcus said in a later interview, his voice still shaking with trauma and frustration. "We told them about the scarring on the hippo, about the way he followed us underwater, about the intelligence we saw in his eyes, but they didn't want to hear it. They kept calling it an accident, but accidents don't hunt you with that kind of deliberate intent." The official report, released just 48 hours after the attack, was a brief, sanitized document that bore little resemblance to the horrific reality that Marcus and Tony had witnessed. The report mentioned an unfortunate wildlife encounter and the inherent risks of river recreation, but provided no details about Bao's documented history of aggression. There was no mention of previous incidents in the area, no reference to the warnings that local fishermen had been sharing for years, and no acknowledgement that this particular hippo had been terrorizing the river for months. Norman's wife, Margaret, was devastated by her husband's sudden death, but she was also determined to get answers about the circumstances that had led to the tragedy. She hired a private investigator, a former wildlife ranger named Samuel Hayes, to look into the events surrounding her husband's death. Hayes had spent 20 years working in African national parks and understood both wildlife behavior and institutional cover-ups. What Hayes discovered during his investigation was a pattern of negligence that went back years, buried in bureaucratic files and suppressed incident reports. Internal emails from the tourism board, obtained through Freedom of Information requests, revealed that officials had been aware of Bao's aggressive behavior since early 2022. Safety reports had been filed by multiple guides, warnings had been issued by wildlife experts, and restrictions had been recommended by park rangers. But nothing had been implemented because of concerns about tourism revenue. They knew, Hayes concluded in his comprehensive report to Margaret, they knew there was a dangerous animal in those waters. They knew people were at risk, and they chose to stay silent because they were afraid of the impact on tourism revenue. Norman's death wasn't an accident. It was the inevitable result of institutional negligence. The tourism board's response was swift and brutal. Hayes was threatened with legal action. His investigator's license was questioned, and pressure was applied to have his findings suppressed. Margaret Lee was offered a substantial settlement in exchange for her silence and a non-disclosure agreement. But the truth has a way of surfacing, especially when social media is involved. Tony Phillips, still traumatized by what he had witnessed, began sharing his story online. His detailed account of the attack, complete with photographs of the damaged boat and GPS coordinates of the incident, went viral within hours. Suddenly, the tourism board's carefully crafted narrative began to crumble. Other guides came forward with their own stories of encounters with Bao. Wildlife experts who had been pressured to stay silent began speaking to reporters. The pattern of negligence and cover-up became impossible to ignore. But by then, it was too late for Norman Lee. The husband, father, and passionate angler was gone, and all the investigations and revelations in the world couldn't bring him back. Chapter 6. A History of Violence. Norman Lee was not the first person to die in a hippo attack, and tragically, he wouldn't be the last. His death was part of a much larger pattern of violence that stretches across Africa and spans decades of human-wildlife conflict. Hippos are responsible for an estimated 500 deaths per year across sub-Saharan Africa, making them one of the continent's most dangerous animals. But unlike other predators, hippos don't kill for food. They kill to protect their territory, to assert dominance, and sometimes, it seems, simply because they can. In 2018, a tour boat on Lake Naivasha in Kenya was attacked by a hippo that killed one tourist and injured several others. The attack was captured on video, showing the incredible speed and power of these seemingly docile animals. The footage went viral, but like so many other incidents, it was quickly forgotten as the news cycle moved on. 2 years later, in 2020, a fishing village in Tanzania was terrorized by a rogue hippo that killed 7 people over the course of 3 weeks. The animal, described by witnesses as unusually large and aggressive, attacked boats, destroyed fishing nets, and even came onto land to chase people through the village. The pattern is always the same. An aggressive hippo establishes territory in an area frequented by humans. Warning signs are ignored or suppressed. Attacks escalate until someone dies. Then there's a brief period of outrage, followed by official denials, and finally, silence. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, a wildlife biologist who has studied human-hippo conflict for over 15 years, believes the problem is getting worse. Climate change is forcing hippos into smaller territories, she explains. Population growth is bringing humans into closer contact with wildlife. And the tourism industry's reluctance to acknowledge the danger is creating a perfect storm for tragedy. The most disturbing aspect of Norman's case wasn't the attack itself, but the systematic failure of institutions to protect public safety. The tourism board had the information they needed to prevent the tragedy, but they chose profit over people. This wasn't an act of nature, says retired park ranger William Foster, who investigated hippo attacks for the Zimbabwean government for over 20 years. This was institutional negligence. They knew Bao was dangerous. They knew people were at risk. And they did nothing because they were afraid of losing tourism revenue. The parallels to other industries are obvious, like tobacco companies hiding the dangers of smoking, like pharmaceutical companies suppressing adverse drug reactions, like oil companies denying climate change. The tourism industry has chosen to prioritize profit over human lives. But the cost of this silence is measured in more than just money. It's measured in lives lost, families destroyed, and communities living in fear. Every attack that could have been prevented, every death that could have been avoided, every tragedy that was covered up, represents a failure of the systems that are supposed to protect us. Norman Lee's death could have been prevented. The warning signs were there, the information was available, and the technology existed to track dangerous animals and warn the public. But instead of taking action, officials chose silence, and that silence was deadly. Chapter 7. The danger continues. 6 months after Norman Lee's death, nothing has changed. Bao still patrols his stretch of the Zambezi River. Tourism operators still take clients to Paradise Point, and officials still refuse to acknowledge the ongoing danger. The Tourism Board's response to Norman's death was to issue a generic safety advisory about wildlife awareness and responsible river recreation. No specific warnings about Bao were issued. No restrictions were placed on fishing in his territory, and no additional safety measures were implemented. Margaret Lee's lawsuit against the Tourism Board is still pending, tied up in legal proceedings that could take years to resolve. Meanwhile, her husband's killer continues to hunt in the same waters where Norman died, and other unsuspecting anglers continue to put themselves at risk. Nothing has changed, says Marcus Webb, who has never returned to the river since witnessing his friend's death. The same boats go to the same spots, the same guides tell the same stories, and the same dangerous hippo is still out there. It's like Norman's death meant nothing to them. Recent reports suggest that Bao's aggression is actually increasing. In October 2023, just 2 months after Norman's death, a fishing guide reported another close encounter with a massive hippo. In December, a tour boat was forced to make an emergency retreat when Bao emerged from the water directly in front of them. The pattern is clear. Bao is becoming bolder, more aggressive, and more dangerous. Each successful territorial defense reinforces his behavior, and each encounter brings him closer to claiming another victim. Wildlife experts warn that the situation is untenable. You can't have a 4-ton killing machine sharing space with recreational boaters, says Dr. Morrison. Either the hippo needs to be relocated, or human access to that area needs to be restricted. But doing nothing is not an option. Unfortunately, doing nothing appears to be exactly what the authorities have chosen to do. The Tourism Board continues to prioritize economic interests over public safety, and the cycle of negligence that led to Norman's death continues unchanged. The tragedy of Norman Lee's death is not just that it happened, but that it was preventable. The warning signs were there, the information was available, and the technology existed to track dangerous animals and protect the public. But instead of taking action, officials chose silence, and that silence was deadly. Today, as you watch this, Bao is still out there, still territorial, still aggressive, still dangerous. And somewhere, another angler is planning a trip to Paradise Point, unaware that they're entering the hunting grounds of Africa's most dangerous predator. Norman Lee's death should have been a wake-up call. Instead, it was just another casualty in an ongoing war between human interests and wildlife conservation, between profit and safety, between truth and silence. The question now is not whether there will be another attack, but when. And unless something changes, unless officials finally find the courage to prioritize human lives over tourism revenue, Norman Lee will not be the last person to die in Bao's territory. His death was a tragedy, but it doesn't have to be meaningless. If his story can spark change, if his sacrifice can save other lives, if his memory can force officials to finally take action, then maybe his death will have served a purpose. But that change has to start with us. We have to demand transparency, we have to insist on safety, and we have to refuse to accept the silence that killed Norman Lee. You're watching Animal Ambush and Encounters, where we bring you the stories they don't want you to hear. If this story moved you, share it. If it angered you, act on it. And if it scared you, remember that fear can be a powerful motivator for change. The silence ends now. The truth starts here.